people that wanted to watch that aren't here can watch it. Do I need to do an introduction, or does everyone here know who I am?
Introduction.
Okay,
I don't know you.
you don't know me. Okay.
Who are you?
Um, right. So I'm Tyler. Um, I'm an alumni at Solent, and I'm currently working at Airship. I'm an environment artist, and I just thought it'd be good to go through some things because I've seen a lot of people like share their work and they don't know about these things, and I don't think they've been taught at Solent at all. I know they weren't when I was there. They've done like a course change since, but I don't think they're being told still. Um, so if I go for like a screen share, this is basically what I was going to go through. So a common thing in environment art, you've got an asset that is too big to have like a single texture set, just like a unique texture completely. Like if you were trying to texture this whole bridge with like a 2K texture, it would be blurry. 4K, it would probably still be pretty blurry. And obviously 4K is just not ideal for a lot of situations. And if you just put a tiling wood texture on it, it's not gonna look great. Like it'll get the job done, but it won't have like any unique, interesting details. So a common way to go about that is have unique sculpts. And the best way to do that is have like a lot of reusable assets that you can then build lots of different things out of. So it's kind of kit bashing in a sense. That's like the best way to describe it. And then you can add different breakup layers on top of that. So you can vertex paint, you can have different shader things going on. And the thing that I'm going to go through in this is making a second UV channel to make mask textures so that you can like get some really detailed breakup going on, like context driven breakup. So yeah, I've just made this little block out bridge. Just made it in Unreal. That's how I do most of my block out stuff. So I'm just going to export all this as one mesh and get it into ZBrush, I guess. Right, yeah, that's all of it. So you can combine it all into one mesh. If you just go into the actor, merge, and then merge. And let's call this like block out bridge. And that just makes a single asset out of it. And then you can just export this. So if you just right click, asset actions, and then export, and you can get an FBX out of this. We don't really care about any of this. Don't want any LODs to be made or like the collision mess or anything. We just need the FBX. So then if we bring this into ZBrush, we can start to like make some meshes based off of this. So the way that we want to work with this isn't to have like 10, 12 different planks. We kind of want to make 2 or 3 planks and then maybe like 1 or 2 poles. And then we're going to reuse those. So that way we can only have like 5 assets in the unique texture instead of like 20 or something, taking up a bunch of UV space for no reason. So what I'm going to do is I've got like a custom ZBrush UI, so I'm just going to try and find where these buttons actually are. So we need to go to polygroups and then auto group. And what that would do is I'll split each mesh into its own group. And then if I just control shift click something, that will isolate it. And then we can just do split hidden. So now we've got this one plank on its own. So now I know this is going to be the right size based on what was in Unreal. And we can use this as a base to start sculpting. Yeah, so I'm not going to go for like crazy detailed wood sculpts or anything, because that would take an hour or two on its own. I really am just going to like rush through the ZBrush part of it, because I feel like most of you would have been taught like roughly how to do ZBrush sculpts. But I will like talk through the pipeline still, because I think what this is going to be is more like a pipeline workflow sort of thing, rather than here's how to make a really awesome sculpt. So yeah, just going to Dynamesh this just to get some more polygons in it, and just start like building up some random woody sort of structure. So just use the clay build-up brush for this. That's pretty good. Gonna need to go a bit higher resolution in Dynamesh. Just getting those like main forms in there. And then Trim Smooth Border is pretty much the main brush I use on like anything for wood or rocks. And it's not like a default brush. You have to go into Lightbox, Brush, Trim, and Trim Smooth Border. And then I normally put a square alpha on it just to make it a little harsher. And then like reduce the intensity a bit. And that just like flattens down areas. It's gonna subdivide it a bit more. So I don't know if people want to like follow along with this or if they just want to watch, but if anyone has like any issues or anything or any questions, then just like unmute yourself and ask away. I generally try and keep the ZBrush sculpts pretty much just big and medium shapes. Don't really do any sort of like tiny wood fibers or anything like that. Just feel like you can get a lot more control of that in Substance Painter or Substance Designer, however you texture it. And if you decide later on that you don't like it, it's just easier to get rid of it.
Are you using a mouse for this?
Yeah, I am. I don't actually use my drawing tablet like ever. Yeah, I just kind of find it easier to use a mouse for a lot of ZBrush. I kind of hate the way that ZBrush works with a drawing tablet. It's kind of awkward to use.
See.
So I just use like a lower intensity brush most of the time. And you can just go over it a few times so you have that control that you would normally get. Right, so I think that's all right base for the main shapes. Just gonna use damp standard just to get some more like cracks in there. The thing that's really good about this trim smooth border brush is that if you've like done too much, you can just hold Alt and it kind of draws back in at your level rather than like chipping away. So like if I start here, hold Alt and drag, I can sort of draw my form back, but it won't go any higher than when I started. And I generally advise try not to use the smooth brush too much because then you start getting your mesh looking really blobby. I don't think I've used the smooth brush at all so far. You can kind of just get away with like trimming stuff away, unless it is a really soft mesh. Like if you're going for like some really rotten wood, then you might need to start using it, but not for this, I don't think. When you're trying to make like a small kit out of stuff like this, it's kind of best not to have like any massive discernible features in the sculpts. Like if I had a massive crack going through this wooden plank, something like that, it'd become really obvious when this plank was reused. So it's kind of nice just to keep it pretty generic, but still have some nice shapes to it. Right, I think that'll sort of do for the purposes that we're going for. It's not like a great sculpt or anything, but I don't want to sit here for an hour just sculpting wood. Right, so that's the first one. And then I normally just duplicate it. Just move it across. And then just mess it up a little bit. Just try and get some like roughly different shapes. Doesn't have to be drastically different, just enough so that you can tell it's not the same plank being reused over and over again. And the good thing about this sort of kit is that you make like a watertight mesh, so there's no holes in it anywhere, so this can be rotated and used from all angles. So this plank, if you're only seeing it from one side, these two planks is basically like 4 planks, because you have the 4 different sides. It's pretty much done. Just get rid of some of these square alpha bits. Right, so we'll call it there for the planks, just so I don't sit here forever just getting some details in these. But we need to get at least one variation of these little side pillars. So I'll just break one of these off.
How did you move the pivot?
How do I move the pivot? So if you hold Alt and just drag this around, you can move the pivot. And then when you just let go, you go back to moving it regularly. You can rotate it like that as well.
Oh, thank you.
And then if you want to reset the pivot, just hold Alt and click the little circle. If you don't hold Alt and click the circle, it will just rotate the mesh back rather than just the pivot. Alright, so I'm just going to do the same sort of thing on this, just dynamesh it and just mess it up a bit. I think we'll just do one of these just to save some time. But normally in a kit, you probably want at least 2 of each sort of mesh, depending on what they are. I think in some of the God of War stuff that's just come on ArtStation, you can kind of try and break it down and see repeating elements like this, and it seems like they have about like 2 or 3 of each sort of asset, mainly for like bricks and stones, because that's what a lot of it is. Right, I honestly think this will pretty much do just for this purpose. With a texture on it, it should look pretty decent. We just need to get some sort of like shape variation in it, so it's not just like a straight line cylinder. Make sure you do that from different angles as well, so you can get a bit of breakup when you reuse this asset. Right, so we'll call that the kit. Like I say, really not pushing for visual quality here. Just trying to get the workflow nailed down. But that should serve the purposes. If I get up my pure ref, sort of going for this like really random broken bridge. And this is going to be a good example of the sort of shader we want to get going so that
All right.
what was that? Okay. Yeah, so there's this sort of shader we're going to get going so that each plank of wood could have this green moss on each side of the texture, but then you couldn't really use this plank in a different situation. So say you want to use this plank on this side bit as well, where it's completely different, doesn't have the moss directly on the top and bottom. You can't do that if it's directly into the shader, directly into the texture, sorry. So yeah, that's where the mask is going to come in. And I don't know if I've got a good example here about like color variation per plank. These are all pretty uniform, but say you wanted each individual plank to have like a slightly different color or like a slightly different darkness. Unless you're doing like the whole bridge as one single asset, one unique texture, you can't just do that. So again, that's what the shader is going to come in for. Right, so I'm going to get these to be our high polys. So we'll just call this like plank 1. Plank 2. And cylinder 1. These aren't too high poly, so we don't need to really decimate these. These should be fine to bake with. But for the low polys, I'm just going to do that in ZBrush. It's pretty much what I always do when I get a sculpt like this, is just decimate it. It's one of the best parts being an environment artist, really. You don't have to retop a lot of stuff. So the way you do that is you just duplicate your high poly. So we've got a high here and a low here. You go to Z plugin, go to decimation master, pre-process current. You've always got to do that. It just like scans your mesh basically. And then you can either enter a percentage or a numbers of polys. So this will be your triangle count. For an asset like this that's going to be reused a lot, you don't want to go too high, but there's not like a specific number you can really put on it. It will kind of like depends on the project. I'm just going to go 1000 and just see what it looks like. So that looks alright. It's kind of wasteful though, I don't really need that much. So I can go a bit lower, like 0.7 or something. Yeah, I feel like it's got enough like edge breakup so that you can tell that it's not just a cube, but it's also pretty low poly. So we'll do that again here. Just duplicate the high, rename it. We'll just do the same 0.7, so 700 tries. That also looks good, got a nice bit of edge breakup. And the cylinder might need to go a little higher just because it's a cylinder rather than a cube, but it is thinner as well. So we'll try the same and we'll see how it turns out. That might be a bit low. Also realized I didn't duplicate it. I just did that to the high. So just undo that. Make a low poly. Like 1000 for this. Yeah, that kept it a bit nicer. So you got that nice like silhouette breakup right there. That should look good. You can try and get like an auto UV out of this. I really wouldn't try and rely on auto UVs. I don't know. I'm going to save it before because I normally crash when I try and do it. But yeah, they're normally pretty terrible. So that should have done it. And then you just go down to UV map, morph UVs. I actually think that's done an alright job, to be fair. Can't really tell because ZBrush's UV stuff is really weird. But we are going to make our own UVs. So if I just get all the low polys together, just export them all in one mesh. So if you put them all next to each other and then you go merge, merge down, okay, merge down, okay. Alright, so that's all the low polys together. I normally use the FBX export rather than exporting up here because I think this does OBJs, which I don't think store the scale. I'm not 100% sure, but we want to make sure it's the same scale as the bridge in Unreal just to make it easier. So we'll just go planks, low poly. And we do the same here, merge these down. Export those. My headset just decided to turn itself off. So can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yep.
cool. Yeah, so they're all exported. We'll just take them into Max, which is where we'll do the unwrap. I am also going to use Maya for a little bit, just because I find that Maya has a better packing system than 3ds Max does. But I like actually doing the unwrap in Max just because of a tool I'm going to show you. So if you go to import, the low poly. This location is a bit weird, but it's not the end of the world. Make that an editable poly. And we can chuck an unwrap modifier on that. So if we just get everything and do a planar on it, and chuck a checkerboard on there. Alright, so you can kind of go about these two ways. These are pretty cubic, so it might work doing like a box projection. So if you go into the UV window, mapping, normal mapping, and go box, you can get an okay unwrap start sometimes. This is a bit of a mess with loads of different holes in it, so we're not going to do that. But the main reason I like 3ds Max unwrapping for organic stuff like this is the seam drawing tool. So if you go into edge mode, and I believe it's this second seam button down here, you can just draw seams directly on your mesh. So if you click an edge, and you can just click all the way around. And it works surprisingly well for decimated geo. Because if you're doing this in Maya, you would have to click each individual edge. I don't know if Blender has something like this. It probably does with a plugin. But doing like decimated planks and decimated rock sculpts are generally pretty easy with this. These are going to be pretty awful UVs just from the way that I'm really rushing this, but it will be enough to get the point across. I would ideally try and have these in like 3 different islands, so you have the end caps and then one long unfolded bit, just because I'm not going to have any hard edges in this because it's such an organic shape. And I'm just going to chuck face weighted normals on it to get better shading. So yeah, if you're going to have hard edges in your mesh, like you might need to on some rocks or something, then you need to have a UV seam across all of those hard edges. Otherwise, you'll get some anti-aliasing issues in your bake, and it won't be pretty. It's like the most common baking issue you normally see is not having your UV seams on your hard edges. Alright, so I got the seams roughly in place and just peel it. Can try and straighten these out as much as possible, but I'm not gonna like straighten the borders of these like you normally would with like a hard surface mesh or anything. There's just no like good automation to straighten a triangle mesh, and doing it manually is going to be a lot of work. Like you'd have to select all these edges and then straighten them or something, and it can be worth it, but often the time you put into it isn't really worth it. It can be spent on the sculpt and getting nicer textures or whatever. So I'm just going to pack this roughly, and it's not going to be great because we didn't unwrap it very well, but it will do the job. So that is our low poly. Just going to do a reset X form to make sure the scales and transforms aren't messed up, and then I'll import the high poly and do the same, just so it's definitely all lined up. Looks like it. A reset X form. Right, then one thing that is always quite good to do on your mesh, especially your high poly, is chuck a weighted normals on there, because ZBrush doesn't smooth your normals properly because it doesn't have smoothing groups. It just puts everything into one smoothing group. But weighted normals, you get nicer shading based on like the angle of the face. So we can do that on the high poly, but especially on the low poly. That will get some nicer shading. So it's not anything drastic, but like if you look at this shape here, you can see you get like less of a weird gradient going all the way across, and the shading is more tight to where the actual bevel is. So that should be good for the low poly. And what I would normally do when I'm making a low poly like this is I would chuck it into Maya and do the packing in there. This unwrap doesn't really need it, but I'll show it anyway. Just because Maya's tools are a lot better for that part of the process specifically. So if you have, as well, you're all students mostly, so with your student licenses you've got both options, so you might as well take the extra minute or two just to get a nicer unwrap. Right. Sometimes when you export from Max to Maya, you get a keyframe. Don't really know why that is, but it happens. And then just make sure you reset your X form and delete history. Alright, so then in the UV editor, if we turn that off, you have the UV toolkit. So if you just select all the faces, open up the Arrange and Layout tab, and then shift-click Layout, you get the options for it, and you want to make sure you're using Unfold 3D, which is the like the better packing algorithm. And then you want to set your target resolution, so I'm just going to use 2K for this. and you want to make sure that you've got rotate shells on and it's on 90 degrees so that you get a nice rotation when it tries to pack. And then down here you also want to set your target size to 2K and make sure you give adequate padding. So I believe the rule is 16 pixels for a 2K texture, then it doubles if you go to 4K, so 32 pixels, and then it halves every time, so 1K is 8 pixels and so on. It's just so that when you get bitmaps of your textures that they work nicely. So if you just bump up the iterations a few times, it will try and find the best unwrap for you. I really don't think it's going to change much here. But if you had a nicer unwrap with more shells, then it would do a much better job than 3ds Max. I think if you go into view, heads up display, statistics, and then percentage of UV space used, you can see down this corner, I don't know if you can on Discord stream, but it says 68% used, and before I had 81% used. So in this case, 3ds Max did quite a bit of a better job. But some of these shells do seem close together. So I don't know if it's given the right padding values or not, but guess we'll see. So the next stage would be baking this down. You can bake it in Painter. Painter is fine, but I like to bake in Marmoset just because you get more control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, no I'm not, I'm going to make a bake scene, then I'm going to import the low poly. That's the wrong mesh. Apparently I can't spell planks. So I'm going to chuck that into the low poly and import the high and put that in the high section. And the scales do not seem to be lined up. Which means I probably didn't re-export the high poly after I reset the Xform in here. Yeah, cool. Cool, now they line up. Yeah, so that's why you always want to import it into 3ds Max, just to make sure you got your scales all right and your rotations. Just because different softwares use different setups. Alright, so in Marmoset, you can go into your low poly in the bake project, and you can see the cage, which is something you couldn't do in Painter until very recently, like in the last update. So yeah, that's like the main reason I've been using Marmoset this whole time, is for this feature. But now Painter is being able to do that, so they're both good options now. But what you want to do is make sure your high poly is visible and your low poly is visible. I'm going to turn off quick bake and then just lower the cage as much as possible whilst making sure nothing peeks out, because then it won't bake. So it all looks good there. So we can just make a location for it. Just make a bake folder. Just use JPEGs for these. Just call it planks baked. If we turn off the high poly, and then we can see the low poly when it gets baked. So we'll just do the normals for now. And chuck that on. All looks like it's baked fine. Do ambient occlusion. Also looks fine. And then the other thing that I would do in Marmoset is a curvature map. Cool, that's all done. So there you go, you can see the curvature map. And I think that's all worked fine. So then we can go on to texturing these. So I'm just going to use Painter for this. I I'm not going to spend ages making some wood textures. I'll probably just chuck on some presets and do a little bit of adjusting to make it look alright. But normally you would want to spend quite a lot of time on the texturing process just to make sure they actually show off your bakes well and all look good. 2K file should be fine for this. One thing to note if you're baking in Marmoset is that they use different normals compared to Painter and Unreal, so you have to do a bake with flip Y, and then that will look wrong in Marmoset. So if you want it to look right in here, you can just flip Y again here, but your actual texture will be fine to use in Painter now. So if we just add the little plus and get some baked textures in here, set them all to texture, import to the project. Alright, then we go to the texture settings here. Make sure to add some AO channel, and then we can drag them in here. So we've got the normal map, got the ambient occlusion, and the curvature. And then we can just do the rest in here. So I've actually not used the new Painter Baker, so this looks a little weird to me. But we just need the other ones. So world space normal, ID, position, and thickness. They should be all you really need, along with the normal and AO and curvature, but we did that in Marmoset. So I think this cage is all good. Looks like it. So we'll just bake that. Cool. Now I don't know how to get out of this window because I've not used this. Oh, there we go. Right, so that's all the textures baked now. And we can just start texturing. So we'll just see what wood they've got here. I think I've downloaded this one before. So if we make it triplanar, rotate it the right way. It looks alright. Like it goes for that rotten wood look. Just mess around with some of these settings. Alright, there's one thing that I would do when texturing in Painter just to make sure that your meshes look as accurate as possible as they will in Unreal is make sure you texture with like a neutral sort of HDRI. I always use Studio Tomoko just so that these don't add any color to your textures. Like if I use this one that's really orange and blue, the textures are going to look really orange. So when you then chuck that into Unreal, that's not going to be represented properly. So these ones are pretty neutral. You have like these white and black ones. This one has a little bit of color in it, but that's fine because your Unreal scene's going to have a little bit of color in it as well. Yeah, and then I would make sure you go into this setting and set your quality to at least medium. You're probably not going to see a difference on the stream, but it does make a difference, especially with reflective surfaces. So if you're working with metals, I would definitely go at least high. But yeah, the higher you go, the laggier Painter will be. So if you're not on like a beast of a PC, maybe just leave it on low. But alright, so yeah, this is looking a bit noisy, a bit much. So I'm just going to go into the height and just lower the intensity of this a little bit. It's already nicer. Yeah, so when texturing these, you kind of want to go, I don't want to say as generic as possible, but same with the sculpting, you don't want any really distinguishable features. Like this black line in the middle of this one is going to be pretty obvious when this plank is duplicated a bunch. So I don't know if we can just easily get rid of this. Not really. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clone stamp it out a little bit, just so I'm not sitting here making my own wood textures for ages. So the way you do that is you can add a paint layer, make sure you're on base color, set it to pass through, and then you can just use the clone tool. I believe you click V somewhere and then just draw in. So if I draw it on like this blank bit of wood here, I can just get rid of some of these details. And you don't want to risk making your textures too boring and plain, but I just want these planks to be pretty simple, and I don't want to spend ages making my own texture. So I'm just going to try and sample some of these more simple bits. And for texturing the bottom of your mesh, that always used to be a pain, but now in Painter you can change it so your camera is where the light comes from, rather than having like your scene just lit by the HDRI. So now you can actually like rotate the bottom, and that's fine. I'm just gonna get rid of some of these darker bits. And these look alright for planks, I think. They're not great, but they'll certainly do the job, just to show the workflow. Alright, so this is going to be our final low poly texture.
You need to stop saying they're not great. I'd be like, this is finished A-level work.
Well, I mean, it's taken, what, like 40 minutes? I mean, you could put a lot more effort into this and get a nicer result. But, I mean, this is some decent texture that I found, so that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But the main thing I wanted from the sculpt is just like this sort of thing on the edges, so you get some nice breakup. These planks are a little low poly, to be fair. Like, that's quite jagged, but it should be okay.
It's game ready.
It is game ready. If you wanted to be really extra about it, you could do some manual retopo and just like flatten out a lot more of this inside geo and just have a lot more of the detail on the ends. So you have like the same poly count, but more of the polys on the ends where the detail really needs to be. And then just have stuff like this, so that you get some subtle breakup. But yeah, I think that should be good for this. So I'm just going to export these textures. I just use the Unreal Pact because it's getting an Unreal and they know what they're doing. I always use Targa just because then you don't get any issues with bits. If you have a 16-bit PNG in Unreal, it won't treat it as an sRGB texture, so it will be way brighter than it should be. So just using Targa just eliminates any chance of that because it's locked to 8 bits. So I am just going to chuck this out into its own folder. The name isn't ideal, but that's fine. I'm just going to test it on Unreal, I guess.
How long did it take you to make this scene?
It was like half an hour of just chucking random Megascan stuff together. The foliage looks really weird for some reason, but
What about the water?
yeah, that was just a simple shader. I can go over what it is if people want to do that at the end.
I'll stop distracting.
It's all good. Happy for people to ask questions or whatever if they have any. Meanwhile, I'm struggling to import my textures because it isn't letting me drag them in for some reason. Cool. So the first thing you do when you import your textures, make sure that your masks are set to masks compression. This is like one of the biggest offenders of people's textures not looking the same in Painter as they do in Unreal. because without this, your mask textures will be sRGB, and you don't want that. You can just leave it on default and then turn off sRGB, but I mean, Unreal has a built-in feature for masks, so you might as well use it. That automatically turns it off. Same with normal, just make sure that it's imported as normal map. Unreal generally detects it and does it automatically for you, but just check that. So I'm just going to make a new material for this. Let's call it planks. Just chuck these in here. So color in color, normal in normal, and this is occlusion, roughness, and metallic. Realistically, you don't need to worry about the metallic if your texture doesn't have anything metal in it. And if your scene is comprised out of a lot of things that don't have metal, you can probably get a better pack than this. You could probably get some different texture in here, like specular or something, rather than just wasting a full channel with just pure black. But yeah, that's fine for now. And then we'll just import these planks. I don't know why it's not letting me just drag into it today. I'm just going to make sure it doesn't make a material, because I don't want it to make its own new one. I've just made one for it. Right. So somehow the scale has been messed up somewhere. Probably from the 3ds Max import. I'm guessing it's exported in inches, which I believe is 2.57 or 2.54. Yeah, okay, so I've just done it in inches. That's just my Max being set up weirdly. Ideally, you wouldn't just scale it up here. You would go and fix it, but for now, I'm just going to leave it as that. Right, so the meshes look fine. Let's check on the material. And they look fine. And the lighting's a bit bright. But they look alright. Yeah, that should do the job for now. I think it is still a bit bright. I'm just going to make sure it's all set up correctly. Cool. Yeah, so it's going to be the first part of the shader, I guess, is we're going to have some controls to control the color. So sometimes you're going to want some shader level control of what the texture looks like, just in case stuff like this where it doesn't look quite right. So what we're going to do is we're going to just have like a darkening feature. So if you hold M and click, you make a multiply node, or you can just search for it. And we're just going to drag this into here and hold S and click to make a parameter. Let's call it lightness and set it to 1 by default. And chuck it in here. Right. So right away that's going to do nothing because we're multiplying this by 1, which is what it was before. But when we save this, we can then click on this and reduce it probably about 0.3. Looks alright. Much closer to what I wanted. So yeah, that works pretty well. You also have some more controls similar to this. If you just want your colors to look a little bit different, you can use the desaturation node. And that will control the saturation. So if we get another parameter, call it desaturate. If we leave it on 0 by default again, that won't do anything. But if we increase it, you can see it desaturates. If you go in negative numbers, it will increase the saturation. But yeah, we don't really need to do this, so we're just going to leave it on 0. Cool. So now that we have our planks looking okay in Engine, they're not really useful in this mesh, this is just to test stuff. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to build a bridge mesh. So that can either be done in Unreal directly if you imported all these planks separately, I could just line this up all perfectly and then combine it like I did with the bridge earlier. But I'm just going to do it max. I think it will be easier. So I'm just going to import the blockout bridge that we exported earlier. I'm just going to make a copy of these just so we have a backup just in case. And I'm just going to detach these into their own meshes so that they're easier to deal with, rather than working with elements, or just work with full meshes. Cool. Alright, so we'll get these, we'll make sure their pivots are in a place that makes sense. And what we can do is we can just chuck the base color texture onto these just so that we know how it looks roughly in here. So if you press M in 3ds Max, you'll probably open up this window. I normally use the slate one just because it's a bit more like the Unreal graph. So if you just drag a material out, we'll just get the base color texture, it should be good enough. Drop that in here. We'll select these meshes and assign that material. And that's all good. And we'll put a roughness value on it so they're not shiny. Right, so this is, I guess, could be the fun bit. And it's basically just building stuff like Lego. So if you have a block out like this, it just lets you easily line stuff up. And obviously we've only got 2 planks, so we want to make sure we're getting as much use out of them as possible. So make sure you're rotating them and try not to put the same plank together too much in the same rotation, because it's going to be quite obvious eventually. This is quite an old bridge, so we don't have to worry about being too precise or anything. And as it's just going into like a messy floor, we don't have to worry about like how well it lines up or anything. If it doesn't line up, it's probably better for this scene. So we can just do whatever looks best. Right, so that should do for now for the planks. And this is going to be a little harder to not look as repetitive just because we made one of them. But the masks later should be good for that. As I said, ideally you want a few variations, but just for time, this should be good. So obviously the way this bridge is going to be used, a lot of these pulleys on these cylinders are going to be underground. So this is a one-time use bridge only in this place. We can go ahead and delete all the pulleys that are going to be hidden by the terrain. But if this bridge is like going to be used multiple times throughout a scene, it's kind of ideal just to have the full mesh with no holes so that you can rotate it and use it however you want. But that is like one of the best things about this workflow is you don't have to worry about using the exact same bridge over and over again, because you've got these planks. You can build like as many variations out of it as you want. And you don't have to worry about scaling it a little bit. You don't want to go crazy with the scales. Textures will start to stretch. But in the shader we can implement some stuff to kind of stop worrying about low res textures a little bit. And wood grain stretches pretty well anyway, because it's all kind of directional. Right, that's most of it. Just get these bottom beams in, and we'll chuck it in Unreal. Right, I'm just going to hide the original one now and try and get rid of some of these weird intersections. Ideally for this sort of bridge you would want like some sort of rope texture or something. You could put that into this texture so that you only have one texture set for this whole bridge. Or you could have like a full-on rope sculpt or something, like connecting these bits. But for now we're just going to have it as planks that are magically floating together. Right, and that does the job. Right, so just going to get one of these and attach. It should just be all of these, attach it all, so that's all one mesh now. I'm going to put the pivot somewhere that makes a little bit of sense at least. I'll just go in the middle and then make sure the mesh is centered in the world. So put the grid back on. That should be good. Right, so before we worry about the second UVs or anything, I will just export this. Let's call it Bridger1 or something. And so we don't have to scale it up in Unreal. I'll just do the inches conversion in here. So it should be like 257%. Right, so that's in here. I can chuck it in there, roughly line it up. And then we can just get rid of all this. Alright, so there's our bridge. It's clipping through the floor a bit, so if we just lift it up. It looks like it does the job. Alright, chuck the planks material back onto it. And it looks alright. You can see it's got no like interesting context driven details about it. Like it looks alright as it is, but it's a very pristine bridge, even though it's meant to be kind of old and worn. There's no moss build up in the right places or whatever. So that is what the second UV channel and the mask's going to worry about. So this could definitely pass as just like a bridge asset on its own. It's just if you really want to push your like level of art further, you need that sort of detail. So you could just do a vertex painting or something, right? So you could set up your material, you could go in and hand paint dirt in all these little corners or whatever, and that would work. But you kind of lack the control. You're kind of driven by how many vertices you have, and it wouldn't give you that level of fidelity that a custom mask would do. It's kind of hard to describe it without seeing it, so I guess we'll just move on to that. Before I go on, is there any like questions or anything? Anything that was unclear or rushed over too fast? I'm going to take that as an astounding no. Or my mic is broke and...
No, your mic
Okay,
works.
just checking. Right, so let's go second UV channel then. So I don't know if this is something that people have really touched on at all at uni, but a single mesh can have multiple UV channels, right? So if I go into the unwrap modifier, we've got this texture where each plank is taking up the space that it was baked in. So if I move this, you've got the other planks that were duplicated, right? So if we were going to make a mask on this, anything in the same space would, like, it would copy the details over on every single plank, so you couldn't get any unique details. So we need an unwrap where each individual plank isn't overlapping each other. And to do that in Max, I'll show you how to do it in Maya as well, because I'm going to go into Maya anyway. But to do it in Max, you go into your unwrap modifier, go down to here where it says map channel, and you just click the little arrow. I don't know how well you guys can see that with compression and stuff, but there's a little arrow here. And then you have the options of move or abandon, which are kind of weird and vague descriptions. But move will take your existing UVs and copy them into a new UV channel. So if I do that, it doesn't look like anything's changed, but I'm now on UV channel 2. If I did that again and clicked abandon, it would undo any work that I had done in that UV channel and just make a new one for me. So if I go back into an unwrap modifier, and do move. So we're in UV channel 2, and we've got our UVs again. So if I then select everything and pack it, we can now get a UV map that has all the planks separated so that we can get individual details on each plank. So I'm just going to go over how to do that in Maya. Did I close Maya? Just because, like I said, I'd prefer to do the packing in Maya anyway. With this sort of pack where it's multiple islands, it will generally be better. So I do a lot of my my unwrapping in Maya. So if I bring the final bridge asset in, make sure to set a scale back to 0. And we put the textures on. Cool. Right, so this is what the textures look like. Then we will go into the UV window, UV editor. And then you also have the UV set editor. And right now we've got one UV channel. We can just copy it, and now you've got a second one.
I have a question.
Yep.
Won't overlapping UVs cause an issue?
No, overlapping UVs are generally just fine. It just means they're using the same part of a texture as another part of the mesh.
Oh, okay.
The only time overlapping meshes are an issue is when you want to bake with them, and Substance Painter bakes every face, so anything that's overlapping will, like, the bake will keep stacking on top of each other. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Right, yeah, so we got the second UV channel. It's kind of hard to tell what you're working in, but if you keep this open, just click the second UV channel. We can rename it. So UV channel 2. Click it. Go to faces. And do the layout thing again. Should all be good. Click apply. Should take a little while because I've got it on 3 iterations, so it's basically doing it 3 times to pick which one worked best. And that's that. It actually doesn't look like it's done a great job again. So we're just going to go back to max. I think this one, yeah, this one looks like it did a better job. So it's going to turn us back into an edit poly to save that. And we can re-export this as our bridge asset. So now if we go back into Unreal, we find the bridge here, and we just go re-import. If we open it up, depending on what our import settings were originally, we're going to have a third UV channel. So 0 is 1 in 3ds Max, then 1 is 2 in 3ds Max, and then this 2 is one that is made itself. So if we look at 0, this is like our regular texture one. 1 is the one that we just made, and 2 is one that it tried to make itself for light maps. And that's just because of a setting that we had. So if we just do remove selected, it's going to give us an error saying that it's currently the light map channel. So we just need to reassign that. We're going to make our light map channel 1. And try and remove that again. Do I need to click apply somewhere? Yeah, there you go. And it's gone. Okay, so now we've got our 2 UV channels that we made, and the one that Unreal made is gone. So right now they're not of any use because we haven't made the mask for the second UV channel. But we can't just use this mesh in Unreal, in Painter, because you can't pick what UV channel you want to use in Painter. For some reason, it just doesn't have that feature. So I'm just going to make a copy of this. I'm just going to call it like bridge UV swapped or something, just so we can easily tell. And we just need to move the UV channel into the first UV channel, just so we can use it in Painter. We're not going to use this mesh, it's just going to be for Painter. So if we go into UV channel. So if we want to go into another UV channel without like changing it, we just click abandon, and then we can see our second UVs. And then we're going to go back down to UV1 and do move. So that's going to move everything. And you can see that our planks now don't have the textures in the right place, like you got the weird seams, because the UVs now don't line up with the texture, but that's fine. So we're just going to export this. Again, we'll just call it like bridge UV swapped. I'm going to check that in Painter. I'm just going to save this in case we need it. And make a new scene with the UV swapped one. Right, so from here, we need to try and figure out exactly what it is we want in these textures. So if I pull up our PureRef again, so a lot of these just have like a darkening effect on the edge of the planks. So we could go for something like that in one of the channels. I personally want to make it so that each plank has a slightly different color. So I'm going to do that in a second mask. And then we could just do like some dirt or moss or something in a third mask. And I think that should be good. So this can be kind of hard to visualize because we can't put our planks texture onto this because we've got the wrong UV channel for the texture. So just so I can get a rough idea of what the wood's going to look like, I'm just going to chuck on the same thing that we used before, just to get it roughly looking the same. It's not going to be right, but it's a lot better than just painting on a white mesh. Cool. Right, that should just give a good idea of what it's actually going to look like. So the way we are going to paint these masks is with the user channels. So when you're painting in Substance Painter, normally you have like the base color channel, the roughness and stuff like that. But you can add your own channels that don't really do anything other than what you choose to do with them. So we're going to make 3 masks. So we're going to use user 0, user 1, and user 2. And then we can add a base layer that only has those channels available. We're going to set them all to black. So we're starting with a blank canvas of what these channels are. And now if we go into this top right menu, we can scroll down and see these channels. And we can see that each one is blank. So now if I add a white layer, so just using user 0, we're going to use this for like the darkening effect. And we're going to set that to 1. So you can see this layer is changing what that actually does. So if we then put a black mask on this and start putting some generators on this, say we use a dirt one, we don't currently have any baked masks because we didn't bake this mesh, but we can just bake itself just to get some rough context driven details. Cool, that should be good enough. So then if we go back into the user channel, we can see that we've got some decent context driven mask here, right? So if we just lower this down, and we can get that detail in between the planks that we are missing in Unreal currently. Like where these planks meet, you would expect like a dirt build-up or moss or whatever, but currently it's just nothing. So I think that's a good starting point for like where the moss would be. Just increase this a bit and get rid of the grunge. Right, so then if we go back into the regular material view, This layer has no obvious impact because it doesn't really do anything. But what we can do is we can also add a color channel to this just to visualize what it would look like on our mesh. So say if this is going to be our moss, we can just color pick roughly from here. And now you can see that we're getting that sort of green build-up in between the mesh. It's a bit noisy because our bake settings weren't very good, so if I go back to the bake, let's increase the anti-aliasing and put some more rays in the ambient occlusion. That'll make it a much smoother bake so that the generators can get a much nicer result. I think that's definitely a good start for the moss, but if we're looking at the reference as well, it's also on the top of these pillars. So what we can do is we can add to this, we can do a new generator, and we can use this one, just do a mask builder. So we're going to build our own mask from scratch. So if we turn off the dirt so we can fully see what this one is doing, we don't really want it to be relied on AO or curvature. We kind of want it to be on the world space normal. So it's going to put a mask based on the world space of like where the normal is facing. So if we open up this, we can increase the top intensity, and that's just going to put it on top of things. Obviously we don't want it everywhere, so we can then break that up with a bit of grunge. If we change our grunge, so we've got a bit of a an edge breakup on this now, so it's not just perfect lines. And then obviously we don't want it everywhere, so we're just going to paint some of this stuff out. Thing is, we want to combine both of these masks together, so we need to change the blending mode of this because currently it's just overwriting everything. So if we just change this to add, and then we can get both of them. If we want more control of this, we can do this in a separate layer, and we can have this one just be the mask for like this.
You cut out.
Yeah, this headset keeps turning itself off today. Don't know what's going on. Where did I cut out?
Just right at the end of that sentence.
Okay. So yeah, we can split up these two masks so that we can have more control over them. So we can have this one just be the dirt and this one just be the Z up part. So if we just focus on the Z up part, we can add some paint. Set it to black, and we can just paint out bits. If we're looking at our reference, the dirt bit is already doing this little area, so we only really want it on these beams. So what we can do is if we go onto this little button on the left, we can select by mesh or by UV channel. So if we do this, we do it by UV channel, make it black, we can just select all of these, and it'll just get rid of it on all of that. Want to make sure we get the ends as well, because these were separate UV channels. Cool. Alright, so now we've got a mask for these bits, and a mask for the planks. It's not as strong as it could be. Alright, and then we'll go in and do a bit of manual breakup. Just get a nicer brush. So this is where you can really benefit from using a specific mask rather than just a vertex paint. Because what vertex painted blending would do is pretty much this, where you would have like very little detailing in it. It would just be kind of flat areas. But with actual hand painting in this, you can go in and add some nice details into the mask, so you can control exactly what detail you're adding in. I'm obviously just going to go rush through this, so it's not going to be the best result.
Z had asked a question in the workshop chat.
Oh, right, okay. What are different UV channels for usually? So really, anytime you want to use a different UV channel is when you want information on your mesh that you couldn't get in the current UV channel. So for this purpose, obviously overlapping UVs, if you want unique elements on overlapped UV areas, you need a second UV channel, which is what we're doing here. You may also use like a second UV channel to store certain information. That's a bit above my knowledge, but like if you're some crazy tech artist, you can put UVs in specific areas of the UV island and use like the position of those UVs in your shader. So then you can like basically store pivots in a UV island. That's quite commonly used, but I don't really know how it works. But yeah, also like say light maps are pretty key, but Unreal normally does those for you. Right, so we'll just leave that there for the moss. Actually, we'll get a bit more on these ends. Okay, yep, so that should do for the moss. Then what we can do next is the darkening. So we're going to do basically the exact same thing. Going to make a fill layer. We've already set the base value of 0, so we're going to use a 1 for this, and we'll set it to white. If you go into the mask, add a black mask. And for this one, I don't know if there's really a generator that can get this exact effect for us. No. Okay, so I think we're just going to paint this one. Basically just wanted these ends to be a little darker. But the reason we didn't do it in the texture is so that every plank isn't exactly the same. So with these masks, you can control kind of anything you need in Unreal. You're not just limited to controlling the color. You can use these to control like the roughness values, metalness, emissive, stuff like that. So this can be another use of what you do. So we could probably do a third mask being like wetness. If we wanted some wet streaks going across this, that would be a good example of what you can use. If you're using this on more of like a sci-fi mesh, you might use it for emissive. So if you're like a bunch of overlapping areas, but you don't want the same emissive texture on every single one, this would be a great use. So you could have some computer screens have different things, or some buttons be emissive, some not. Right, so that's those planks. Nothing really any of these references show where it'd be used elsewhere, where they get darker. So I think we should be good for that. But I guess we could combine the color variation into this. So right now, if I set this color to black, you can see what it's doing. So it's like darkening those areas. If we put the wood back on and make this a lot less intensive, so it's got a bit of a darker edge. What we can do is we can do like a faint solid color on each plank just to give them a little bit of variation. So if I go back into the mask view of this, and if I make a new layer, again, user 1, add a black mask, and add some paint. So if we go into, I don't know if mesh fill will do the whole mesh. Okay, no, cool. It's because each individual thing is like its own little mesh, even though it's one file. So this works really well for this. So if we can go in with slight values, so this one can have like a 0.1 effect. This one can be like 0.2. Maybe that one's not got it at all. Maybe this one's got really dark. Right. So now if we make this a little bit more intense, if we put the color back on this, you can see that each plank has kind of got a slightly different color. I can exaggerate it just to make it a little bit more obvious. And if we turn off the green. So each plank will have this multiplied over their base color, so it will darken a little bit. So the darker the texture in here, the darker the texture in Unreal. I think that's a pretty decent start. We can just do that to some of these side pillars as well to break those up. So if we go back into the mesh selecting, there we go. Right, I'm going to turn off this levels because we don't want it to be that extreme. And that should be good. So I don't know if we really need a third mask just for this. Can maybe do like some muddy footprints or something down the middle just to show it off, how you can use it for different things. So I'll just quickly do that. So if you go into this user channel, see if we can get a better brush for it. Right, and then if we just chuck some roughness on this, you can hopefully see what that does. So I don't know how well that's picking up in this stream, but where we have painted this, we can have these like sort of muddy footprints that are like wet. And I think that should be good for all the masks. Alright, so we don't need any of these colors on right now. That was just to visualize it in Painter. All we are going to be exporting is these user channels. So I don't believe there's like a preset that is in Painter already, so we're going to have to make our own. What I normally do is I will just take the Unreal one, click this button here, and that copies it. Then we can delete the color, the normal and the emissive, and we just have this pack texture. So if we rename that like RGB masks, or we can be a bit more specific to what each one was. So it was like moss, darkening, wetness. And then if we scroll down here, we have the user channels. So user 0, drag it into R from the gray channel, user 1 into G, and user 2 into B. And then make sure to select it. Did we rename it? Let's just rename it to workshop masks. Cool, we're using the right one. Again, Targa. And we'll just leave it at 2K for now. Generally, in the production, you can have this mask be quite low res because you generally can use this mask to blend between your regular texture and like a tileable texture. So then you can get some of that quality back, because otherwise each mesh having a 2K secondary texture can become quite expensive. So even just making it a 1K texture is 4 times less the size. So let's just export that and bring it into Unreal. So we're going to do the same thing when we make it masks. And then if we separate the channels, we can see what each mask is doing. So this one was the moss, then the darkening, and the little footprints. So we can start bringing that into our texture. So if we drag it in, and this is where we kind of start messing around with shaders. So I'm just going to make some space for it. So what we can do is we're going to start with the moss. I don't know if I have a moss texture in here, but I've got the bridge plugin enabled, so I'm going to search for one. That'll do the trick. We just need something to blend with, because you know in Painter, when we were doing it, it was just the flat green texture that didn't look good. It's obviously not what it would be like in real life. You would have actual moss with actual fuzz and little leaves or whatever in it. So we're just going to add this to our scene. And now we've got these textures. Obviously in your own projects you can make your own moss textures, dirt textures, whatever you want to use. Just for the sake of this, I'm just using Megascans for all the stuff that I'm not making myself. Right, so what are they set up as? Occlusion, roughness, displacement. Okay. So the way this works is we're going to use the masks as like an alpha channel between a blend. So we're going to use the lerp nodes. If you hold L and click, you get a lerp node, which basically takes two inputs. So we're going to take our wood and the moss and the mask and the alpha. And I'm going to check that in the base color. We'll just do the base color for now and just get that looking right. And you can see it's just put it where we painted it. So that's quite good. So what we can do now is just to make sure we're getting like a decent level of quality is control the tiling of that independent to the tiling of the wood. So if we make a text coord node and a multiply and a parameter, we can call it moss tiling. Default it at 1 and chuck that into the moss texture. You can chuck it into all of them just to make sure. Obviously we haven't done anything with these just yet. And then we can increase the tiling of this. So we set it to like 10 might be a bit high. About 5. So now you can zoom in quite close to that and that still like holds up. I think that does a decent job. But I think, yeah, okay, so the mask wasn't set up correctly. What we have forgot to do is tell Unreal to actually use the second UV channel to put the mask on. So if we take a text coord node, we have these options here for coordinate unit. So 0 is UV channel 1 and 1 UV channel 2. So if we take that and plug that into the UVs here of the mask and we reapply that, there we go. It's actually using the second UV channel. So that's where we actually painted it. Before it was just taking the second UV channel mask and just placing it on the first UV channel, which is why it was kind of all over the place. But that is looking alright now. So we can do the same sort of thing for the rest of the textures. So we can use another lerp and blend between our base texture for the normal, base texture for the moss, and make sure we use the same alpha. Then the same thing for the other textures. So we got occlusion, this is where it kind of becomes a bit of a mess. But hopefully it's kind of easy to follow along still. So we've got occlusion and roughness. I won't really worry about metallic because we're not using it. But there we go. So now we've got some nice normals on the moss. It sort of works as a nice little breakup point. So then we're just going to apply the same logic into all the other masks really. But to avoid this becoming a huge mess, we're going to use a thing called material attributes. So if I do set material attributes, I get this little node here that I can add arrays to add more inputs. So we can kind of combine all these textures into one node. So I'm going to have base color, gonna have normal, gonna have roughness, and I'm gonna have ambient occlusion, and we can do that here. And we can get rid of metalness because we don't need it. Yeah, so we can get the outputs of these two and use a blend material attributes. And that just combines it all together in one nice little node instead of using all these. Only problem is now is you can't just plug this into your output. So you've got two options. You can break it and then you get all the outputs and you can plug all the outputs into this. Or what kind of makes the most sense, unless you need to do other stuff to it, is in your main shader, you can just click use material attributes and it will just change the output node into a material attribute, and you can just plug that right into there and it will just work. So this should make no visual quality difference to the mesh. It looks exactly the same, it's just the nodes are much easier to read now. Cool, so now we can move on to the second mask. So the second one was just the darkening, so we don't really need to do a whole lot to this. In fact, we can probably do it before we combine to the mask because we don't want to darken the mask, we just want to darken the wood. So we're just going to do the same sort of thing we did here, where it's just another multiply of the base color. We can just call it mask darkening or something like that. And we can just blend between the untouched texture and the darkened texture based on the green channel, which was our second mask. So we've set this to 1 to begin with, so we're multiplying it by 1, so nothing is going to happen. If I just set this to 0, it should be quite obvious. You get that darkening. Right, so you've got some planks being dark, other ones not being dark. And that is all good. So if we set this back to a regular number, you can see it's quite subtle. It doesn't really add a whole lot, and that's just because the way we're doing it is we're just darkening it by a flat value. We can add a color into this instead, and that will be a little bit more of an interesting result. So if we hold V, we can get a parameter color, and we can just call this darkening color. We can plug that in, we can give it a default color. If we just color pick the wood and make it a bit darker and more saturated. I think that works a bit better. So if I set this to 1, that's how it normally is, and then like 0.3. If you increase the saturation, you can see it's actually increasing the saturation in those areas of the mask. So you get a bit more color variation, and it's not just a flat wood texture on every single one. So I think that works quite well. The only thing is, in these references, these darker areas, they sort of seem like they're probably a little wetter, and that's why they're darker. So that's when we can control the roughness as well. So we're going to do the exact same thing as we've done here. So we're just going to multiply the roughness by a value with this mask. So our roughness is in the green channel here. So I'm going to get our original one. I'm going to get a multiplied version. I'll call it darkness, roughness or something. And then also take that mask and chuck it in here. And now these patches have become wet. If I get a highlight, there you go, you can see that these patches are wet. So a value of 0 in this will be completely wet. 1 will be exactly what it was before. So if we got like a halfway, like a 0.3 or something, you just get a little bit of variation. And then we did that exact same setup in the second mask. So if we just copy and paste that, and do the same thing. Obviously it's not ideal having multiple masks doing kind of the same thing. I just did this as a way to show that you can have multiple different masks doing different things and controlling different channels. But now you can see that with this setup, you've now got some nice little footprints that are wet going across the middle. And that's sort of given it a lot more interest than the original one. So if we just get a side by side of what these would have looked like. We just delete all of this. You can see there's a lot more variation and a lot more unique detail that you couldn't get just from the original sculpts. I think it's just like an essential workflow that every environment artist should be like using in their scenes, whether it's for wood. It works really well on like stones or like stairs, bricks especially. Yeah, you can use it in a lot of different type of things, and it just sort of makes for a much more visually interesting asset. And I think that is everything I had planned to go over. Yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any questions about that or anything else that they wanted me to go over. Don't know how long you guys want to stay here for. It's already been like 2 hours.
Silence.
Just pure silence, yeah.
Yeah, welcome to what our class was like the past 3 years.
Yeah, that's what ours were like as well.
Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, well, if no one else has anything they want to ask or anything that like they've learned at uni that they're confused about or anything they think
Everything.
wasn't covered, that's not a good sign. I'm happy to answer anything or expand on anything.
Are you planning on making more workshops like this?
I can do. Yeah. If people think they're useful, I can
I do
definitely do
find
more.
them useful.
Okay.
Like super useful.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely can do. I might get in touch with Neil and get like a more official version done, if that is maybe easier for people. rather than like 7 o'clock on a Friday.
Also, where can we expect to get the recording posted? Because I definitely want to have them saved.
Yeah, well, this is where I check OBS and find out that it's not recorded anything. Now, it seems to be all good.
Recording the whole time.
I hope so. I hope it's not corrupted. Yeah, I can probably just chuck it on a Google Drive link or something. Maybe YouTube. And then I'd have to like kind of get confirmation of anyone that spoke if they don't mind their voices being on YouTube or whatever.
It's just me, bro.
Yeah, it was just
Yeah,
on.
okay. So yeah, that could probably be chucked on YouTube. That would probably be easier.
I would be very grateful. That would be awesome.
Cool.
It was very useful. Hold on.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Why haven't
thank
you
you
told
so
me any of
much
this
for
stuff?
this.
This has been sick.
All right. Oh yeah, Tommy, you asked about the water, right?
Yes, I did.
So this is just using Unreal has a shader called single layer water.
Oh yeah, this is just using that. So easy.
So if you go into the shading model, normally it's just default lit. But if you have single layer water, and then you get this little node, I think you have to add it yourself, but it doesn't let you make the material without it, so you have to add it.
Right.
And it's just got a few little inputs of values that control how the light works when it goes through the plane.
You're gonna have to show me this more in a private session.
Okay,
AKA just stand next to my desk.
Okay. Well, I know you guys have learnt this. This is just like
Yeah.
panning textures, two normal maps, blend them together. That's doing pretty much all of the work.
Oh, I see.
But this
You put
single
rocks
layer
under
water
it?
thing, no, I think it's just the floor.
Right, yeah, because it looked really cool.
Yeah, so it's just two inputs. You have this one that controls what light is absorbed by the water. So if you want your water to be blue, you do the opposite of that. So you can see that's made it very blue. And you can control how much of that goes through. And then you have this second one, which I'm going to be honest, I don't really know exactly what it does. It's kind of the opposite. It's like what shows. So I kind of used it as like making it a dirty, muddy, cloudy water. So if I lowered this one again, that's what this color is down here. Like you have like little pockets of color.
Yep. Very cool.
That sort of controls that. Right, I guess if there's nothing else, then we can call it there. Unless anyone's got any last questions.
Nope.
Nope.
I'm all good.
All good.
How can we be you?
I'm sweet.
How can you be me? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yes.
Well, you can't be me.
Unfortunately.
That role is taken. Yeah, I don't know what you mean by that question. So,
You're very talented.
just work outside of uni. Don't just do your units. Try and do stuff outside of your units.
It's not possible.
Don't believe everything a teacher tells you. Do your own research.
You're trying to tell me not to make wood textures in Photoshop?
That is a key skill that you never need to learn.
Good thing Adam's gone.
No, it's not a good thing Adam's gone. It's just,
Well, he's not going to be telling anyone how to make wood textures in
there's
Photoshop.
just some advice that if it sounds a little fishy to you, research it yourself and see if it is an up-to-date technique.
Fair
Because
enough.
I can't imagine, other than like the art leads that have been in the industry since that was viable, I can't imagine anyone is actually using that technique.
Is that your computer I can hear, bro?
Yeah, it's just kind of blowing up right now. It's these
Anyway.
mega scans trees.
Is this class dismissed then?
Yes, I guess it is.
Thank you very much for doing
Alright.
this for everyone.
No worries.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
This has been awesome.
All right. Well, I'll see you guys later.
See you
Yeah.
guys.
Why are you
Thank you.
laughing, Will?
I'm not laughing.
He said cheers.
I
What do
had
you
a-
mean?